Double life of risk and excitement. A successful entrepreneur leads a double life of risk and excitement. Everything changes when he meets a man who knows his secrets. Now he's in danger, faces exposure, and the destruction of everything he's accomplished. I've always considered myself a man of luck. Maybe even a little too lucky. Boring days seemed unbearable, so I decided to add some spice to my life. By the time I was 35, I was running a technology company, but behind the shiny business window was something else: dark, dangerous, and frankly, incredibly exciting. Work consumed all my time. My friends joked that I lived on a few USB drives and conference rooms, but it never occurred to them that behind the mask of a respectable businessman, there was a mask of a businessman. Behind the mask of a respectable businessman was a real adventurer. My meetings with dubious partners, secret parties in godforsaken places, and socializing with people far from business standards became an integral part of my life. In addition to my work, I led another life. Enjoying my achievements, I plunged into the world of casinos, nightclubs, and risky deals. I had an expensive car, a spacious apartment, but I wanted more. I craved adrenaline risk. Yes, it was dangerous, but how exciting it was. Every day I put on an elegant suit, neatly styled my hair, and went to the negotiations, not realizing that soon my double life would come out. My main secret was my talent as an actor. I had mastered the role of a successful man, once a fun experiment. Now that acting had become a necessity, everything changed in an instant. One evening, when I was again in one of my favorite clubs, a stranger approached me. His name was Edward. He was a man with sharp eyes, and a sly squint instantly caught my attention. He sat down next to me and said, "I know who you really are." These words hit me like a hammer. My heart began to pound frantically, and anxious thoughts began to swarm in my head. I tried to stay calm by smiling back at him, but I was seething inside. How could he know? What exactly did he know? Edward ordered a glass of wine and watched me carefully. His eyes bored into me, as if trying to solve a riddle. After a few minutes, he said quietly, "Life becomes dangerous when you play games like this." His words sounded ominous to me. I began to weigh the possible scenarios. I'd always thought I was in control, but now I realized that Edouard could see right through me. He had begun to infiltrate my life like no one before him. With every minute I interacted with this man, I felt he was a threat to my peace of mind. He wasn't just going to expose me, he was going to destroy everything I'd built. As long as I could keep him at a distance, it remained just a game, but I knew I had to protect myself. As I tried to throw him off balance, I noticed that he never lost his composure. He kept searching for the truth, slowly destroying my mask. When he started talking about my affairs, my debts, and the things I held dear, I realized he wasn't just an observer. He was a man with a clear agenda. "You won't be able to control this forever," he said calmly, looking at me with a slight smile that seemed friendly on the outside but made me shiver on the inside, trembling. When I got home that night, I felt fear overwhelm me. Everything that had once seemed so safe and secure had suddenly turned into something sinister. The success I've been working towards for years could crumble like a house of cards. I sensed that disaster was coming, and I wouldn't stand a chance. Pouring myself a glass of whiskey, I sat down in a chair and plunged into gloomy thoughts. Suddenly the phone rang. At that moment, my whole life froze in place. Picking up the receiver, I heard Edward's voice. A cold, confident tone, as if foreshadowing the storms to come. "I know where you are, Michael, and I have a proposition." I sat in the semi-darkness of my apartment, holding the phone receiver in my hand as if it were something poisonous. Edward's voice echoed in my head, reminding me how close he came to unraveling my double life. I was filled with fear mixed with curiosity. What did he have to offer? What cards did he have up his sleeve? "Let's meet tomorrow morning," Edouard continued, "at the cafe on the corner of 5th Avenue and 40th Street. 10 o'clock. Come along." Without waiting for an answer, he hung up. I sat in silence, trying to make sense of what I'd heard. Meeting Edouard could either be my salvation or the beginning of the end. But I had no choice. If I refused, I would lose control of the situation completely. And if I agreed, what then? The next morning, I got up early, barely before dawn. The thought flashed through my mind that this might be the last normal day of my life. I dressed in my usual business suit, trying to look as casual as possible. But inside me, everything was clenching with tension. The cafe was in the center of the city. A crowd of people rushing to work flowed by. I arrived exactly at the appointed time and immediately saw Edouard sitting at a table by the window. He looked relaxed, as if nothing had happened. I sat down across from him, trying to remain calm. "You look good, Michael," Edward said, taking a sip of coffee. "I hope you had a good night." I nodded, not knowing what to say. We exchanged a few sentences about the weather and the latest news, but we both knew it was just a prelude to the main conversation. Finally, Edward got down to business. "Michael, I'm offering you a deal. I've learned a lot about your activities outside the office. But instead of exposing you, I want to use your skills and connections of your skills and connections. I'm willing to offer you a project that will make us both a lot of money. But in return, you'll have to work for me." I was silent, digesting the information. Edouard's offer was tempting, but also dangerous. Working for him meant losing control of my life completely. But to refuse meant risking exposure. "What exactly do you want from me?" I finally asked. Edward smiled, but his eyes remained cold. "I want you to use your connections in the high-tech world to gain access to certain data. It'll be illegal, of course, but you're used to this kind of thing, right?" I sighed, realizing I was walking into a trap. To refuse was to jeopardize my career and reputation. Accepting it meant taking an even greater risk. But I had no other choice. "All right," I said. "I agree. But let's talk about the details." Edouard nodded and opened a laptop lying on the table. Charts and documents appeared on the screen, and he began to explain. I listened, trying to memorize every detail. But in the back of my mind, I knew I had stepped on a slippery slope from which there was no return. A few weeks passed after our first meeting with Edouard. Life continued as usual, but every day I lived with the feeling that I was standing on the edge of the abyss. Work at the office in the office, but my mind kept returning to what was going on behind the scenes. I became more cautious, avoiding unnecessary contacts and scrutinizing every message I received. One evening, as I was sitting in my office reviewing reports, I got a call. It was Edouard. He briefly informed me that it was time to start implementing the plan. The scheduled meeting was to take place in 2 days in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. I agreed. Day X came. I arrived at the warehouse early, trying not to attract attention. The place was gloomy and deserted, perfect for this sort of thing. Edouard showed up exactly at the appointed time, dressed in a black jacket and dark glasses. His assistant, a tall man with a stern face, stood beside him. "Greetings, Michael," Edward said, extending his hand. "I'm glad you're here." We entered the warehouse. It was dark and damp inside, with old boxes and tools lying around. Edouard turned on a flashlight, lighting the way. We walked deep into the room, and a metal door appeared in front of us. Edouard took out a key and opened it. Behind the door was a small office equipped with computers and monitors. There was order and cleanliness here, in sharp contrast to the rest of the warehouse. Edouard pointed to a chair near one of the computers. "Sit down," he said. "Let's get started." I sat down, feeling the tension building. Edouard explained the task. We needed to hack into the server of a large corporation and gain access to their financial data. It had to happen discreetly, without tampering. I started to work, using my hacking skills, which I used to use only for fun. Time passed, and I gradually made progress. Each step was like a move on a chessboard, requiring precision and calculation. Edouard watched the process, occasionally asking me questions and advice. His assistant stood silently to the side, watching us. After a few hours, I finally succeeded. The server was accessed, and we were able to download the necessary data. Edward smiled, patting me on the shoulder. "Great job, Michael," he said. "You did better than I expected." He took the flash drive with the data and left the office, leaving me alone. I stayed there for a while, collecting my thoughts. What had I done? Where would this lead? These questions were swirling around in my head, keeping me on my toes. When I got home, my mood was depressed. I realized that I had become part of something big and dangerous. But what to do next? Continue to play by Edward's rules or try to find a way out of this game? The next day, I received a message from Edward. He suggested we meet again, this time in a different place. I agreed, hoping that I could find out more about his plans and find a way to free myself from his influence. The meeting took place in a small restaurant on the outskirts of town. Edward was already there when I arrived. He looked pleased and relaxed, as if nothing had happened. "Michael, I'm glad you could make it," he said, rising to meet me. "We have an important conversation today." We sat down at a table in the corner of the room, away from the other customers. Edouard ordered a bottle of wine and began to talk about the next stage of our cooperation. According to him, I have another operation, much more complicated and riskier. "You will have to infiltrate the building of a large bank and install a special device," he explained. "This will allow us to access their security systems and commit a major theft." I was silent, trying to comprehend what he was saying. This was too much. The risk of getting caught was becoming real, and the consequences could be catastrophic. But to refuse meant facing Edward's wrath, and that didn't bode well either. "Think carefully, Michael," Edward added, noticing my confusion. "You have a choice. Either you complete the mission or your secrets will be revealed." I looked at him, feeling my insides tighten with fear and anger. But what could I do? The answer was obvious. I had to agree, or everything I'd built would fall apart overnight. "Okay," I said at last. "I'll do it." Edouard smiled, raising his glass, "To our successful cooperation." As the days passed, I became more and more entangled in the web Edouard had woven. With each assignment, he became more and more confident, and I became more and more dependent on his will. My only hope was to find a way out of this trap, but each new step only strengthened his hold over me. Soon, however, events took an unexpected turn. One evening, as I was returning home from a business trip, a black car pulled up in front of me. Two men in suits that looked familiar to me got out of the car. They asked me to get into the car, and I had no choice but to comply. I was brought to an unknown place, an old factory, abandoned and dilapidated. Inside, I was met. It was Edward, but this time he looked different. His face was serious, almost grim. "Michael," he began, stepping closer. "I'm sorry to have to arrange this meeting this way, but the circumstances call for drastic measures." "What's going on?" I asked, feeling the anxiety building inside me. Edward took a deep breath, as if gathering his strength before continuing. "You have to complete one more task for me to trust you completely. You are a good performer, but you are too unpredictable. I can't afford to take risks, especially given the scope of our operations." His gaze became harder, as if he was reassessing me, analyzing my every gesture, every movement. I knew I'd never get out of this. He was the master, and I was just a pawn in his game. Edward made a barely perceptible gesture with his hand, and one of his assistants, standing nearby, immediately approached. He took out a folded sheet of paper from the inside pocket of his jacket and handed it to me. The paper was thick, expensive, with several lines of text written in neat handwriting. "This is your new assignment," Edouard said, looking at me intently. "You realize that not only our future work together depends on it, but also your safety." I unfolded the paper and read the contents. The task was complex and dangerous, requiring the highest level of concentration and professionalism. Fear was building up in me like a wave, but at the same time there was an unusual sense of closure. You have 3 days, Edward added, looking at his watch again. I'll be waiting for the results. Don't let me down, Michael. He turned and headed for the exit, leaving me alone with my task and my thoughts. The assistant followed him, closing the door behind him. I was left standing in the room, holding the piece of paper that now determined my fate. I ran through the streets without stopping. Finally reaching my house, I slammed the door and locked it from the inside. Then I tried to calm down and put my thoughts in order. What to do next? Edward would surely find me, and then the end was inevitable. But I couldn't just give up. I had to act quickly and decisively. I thought of an old friend I hadn't talked to in a long time. He worked for the FBI and always said he'd help if I needed it. I dialed his number with trembling hands. "Steve, it's Michael," I said when he answered. "I need help. I'm in a lot of danger." Steve listened to me without interrupting. Then he promised to come as soon as possible. I waited for him to arrive, sitting in the dark, listening to every sound outside. When Steve finally arrived, he immediately took matters into his own hands. Together, we devised a plan to give Edward the fake data to buy time. Steve promised to enlist his colleagues to protect me. The next few days passed in suspense. I continued to fulfill Edward's assignments by passing false information to him. Steve and his team worked on gathering evidence against Edward and his gang. And then came the decisive moment. The police ambushed another meeting with Edward. When he arrived at the location, it was surrounded by FBI agents. Edward tried to flee, but was apprehended. The investigation revealed that Edward was the head of an international criminal network involved in cybercrime and financial fraud. Thanks to the evidence gathered, he was sentenced to a long prison term. For me, it was an opportunity to start a new life. I decided to leave the world of technology and do something less dangerous. Steve helped me disappear through the witness protection program so that Edward and his men would never find me again. Now I live in a small town, work as a simple programmer, and try to stay away from big cities and dangerous adventures. Sometimes I remember those times when risk and adrenaline were part of my daily life, but I realize that happiness lies in simplicity and stability. The main thing is to never forget that glitz and luxury can hide dark sides that can swallow you whole.